Alright guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I want to start talking about variables, and variables I think should be the first thing that you should learn if you're just getting into programming. It is absolutely imperative that you have a solid understanding of what a variable is and how to create a variable, because you will be working with them frequently. It doesn't matter the programming language, the variables are one of the core building blocks of programming, regardless of the programming language that you're using. So what is a variable? A variable is a way for us to store data. You can think of it as a compartment that you can give a name, and you can then put just about any type of data you want in that compartment. You can then later access whatever is stored in the variable by simply calling the variable by its name. So over here, I am on jsfiddle.net. This is where I'll be writing and running the code for this video. If you want to follow along, I will include a link in the description of this video. Um, and I highly recommend that you do, because this is how a lot of this stuff will, stick with you, is by actually following along and practicing the stuff that we'll be going over in this video. So in JSFiddle, you're going to want to go to the JavaScript tab, and over here you can see I already have some stuff um, here, and this is what we call in programming comments. Comments are meant to be a way for you to write notes in your code. It will be ignored whenever you run your code, but it's again just meant to serve as a way for you to add notes in your code. So the first thing that I want to go over is how to declare an empty variable. And to do this in JavaScript, we first start by typing the keyword let, and then the next thing that we do is we give the variable a name. So we can use anything for the name, but it's recommended that you choose a name that is uh, descriptive and related to the type of data that that variable will be holding. So I want to declare an empty variable that will hold an email address. So I will call the variable email. So this is how we declare an empty variable. We use the let keyword and followed by the name of the variable. So this is how we create an empty variable, but this isn't really useful as it is, because of course variables are used to store data. So let's see how we can assign a value to this email variable that we declared. And to do that, it's very simple. First, we type the variable name and then the equal sign, and on the right hand side of the equal sign, we type whatever value we want to store in the variable. So in this case, I want to store an email. I will simply type out an example email. So do@email.com. And this brings us to a very important point. What type of data can we store in a variable? There are three common types of data that we can store in variables. The first one is what I'm using here, and we call these strings. These are a sequence of characters, right? So it can be a sequence of letters, sequence of numbers, sequence of symbols, a mixture of both. And a string is usually enclosed in quotes, right? So you can enclose a string in double quotes, or you can close them in single quotes, right? So for example, like this. Okay, but I'm just going to leave it with the double quotes for now. So this is a string. The second type of data type that we the second type of data that we can store in variables are numbers, and numbers are, I mean, it's very self-explanatory in the name, right? You can store integers or you can store decimals. So let's take a look at that. Let's declare an empty variable called age, and we're going to store an age in this variable. So an age is a number, and so to store a number in this variable, well, we should type out a number, right? So let's say, for example, 24. So this is storing an integer. Age is storing an integer with the value 24. let's see how we can store a decimal, right? So to store a decimal in a variable, let's create a variable called average, and let's assign a decimal to average, and let's say 75.4. Okay, so email is holding a string, age and average are both holding numbers. Age is holding an integer 24 and average is holding a decimal 75.4. And the last type of data that well, not the last type of data, but the last type of common data that most people use are what we call Boolean values. And these are simply true and false values. So imagine we have a flag that tracks if a user's account is enabled or not, right? So let's call this variable enabled, and this can hold either a true or false value. So let's see how we can assign a Boolean value to this variable. So again, following the same pattern of assigning a value to a variable, we have the variable name followed by the equal sign, and on the right hand side we assign the value. And because we want to store a true or false value here, all we have to do is type true or false. So in this case, true. So this is the third type of data that we can store in a variable. So a Boolean value, a true or false value. Okay, so up here we saw how to declare empty variables. Here we got a look of how we can assign values to variables. Now let's see how we can change a variable's value, okay? Because we're using let to declare our variables, we have the ability to change a value in a variable as many times as we want. So let's change the value in email to John at example.com. Again, changing the name, changing the value of a variable is quite simply the same as assigning a value to the variable. You just, start with the variable name followed by the equal sign, and on the right hand side you specify what value you want, and this is how you change a value in a variable. So over here we start off by assigning um, doe at email.com to the email variable, and then over here we've changed that to john at example.com. So this is how we can change a variable's value. Okay, now let's look at how we can declare and assign a value to a variable in one line of code. So in the previous example, we've sort of did this in two steps. So the first thing we did was declare an empty variable, and then in the second step, we assigned a value to a variable. But we can actually do this in just one line of code. We can declare a variable and give it an initial value. So to do that, let's say we create a variable to hold a country, and we want to start it off at a particular country name. So let's say England. So in this example, we are declaring and initializing a variable in one line of code. And we can do this with not just a string, but with any other type of data that we've looked at. So it could be with a number, it could be with a boolean. You don't have to make it do this in two steps. You can do that if you want, but you can initialize it as well, right, in one line of code. Now we can create another type of variable. We can declare another type of variable where, let's say you want to create a variable with an initial value, and once you've assigned that initial value to the variable, you don't want to have or give the user the ability to alter that value, right? Instead of using let, we would use const to create a value that would satisfy those requirements. So to create a variable whose value can only be supplied once and won't be able to be changed further, we use const. And so we just do const, let's say date of birth equals to 23rd of the 10th of 2001. So a date of birth is something that probably, it won't change, right? It's not a type of data that is going to change. So instead of using let to declare and create the variable, we use the const keyword. And by using the const keyword, once we've assigned a value, and it is absolutely required that you supply an initial value to a const variable. Once you've assigned a value to the variable, you won't be able to change that value. So to give you an example, let's say I want to change DOB or date of birth variable to something else like 10 the 10th 2001. Immediately you will see that I will be getting an error over here, and it's telling me that you're trying to override a value a value from a variable that was created using the const keyword. So const is short for constant, and this is basically telling us that we can't do this because we declared this variable as a const. But if we change this to let, you can see that the warning goes away. So that's the difference between declaring a variable using the let keyword and the const keyword. If you use the let keyword, you don't have to supply an initial value, and you can change the value of the variable as many times as you want. However, by creating a variable with const, it is required for you to supply an initial value, and once you supply that value, you will no longer be able to change that value. These are the two ways that most people create variables in JavaScript. Okay? And so now the final thing that I want to show you guys is how to actually access the values that are stored in these variables, because that's what we're going to be doing. Um, when you create a variable, you're not just creating it, just to have a variable creating. You're creating it because you're probably going to be using it somewhere else in your code. You're probably going to be using it in additional logic in your code. So let's take a look at an example of how we can actually call a variable and access the value that's stored in that variable. So what I want to do is I want to print this value onto the screen. Okay, so I want to access email and I want to print though at email. Well, actually, since we override the value of email, I want to print john at example.com onto the screen. So how do we do that? So let me just type it out and then I'll explain it to you. So to do that, I'm going to do console.log, and in here I will pass in the variable name that I want to access its value, so email. So this will take the value john at example.com and print it out onto the screen, or I should say print it out to the console. So if you're on jsfiddle.net, what you can do is, if I just expand this column, at the bottom here, you're going to see a console tab. So if you click on that, this will bring up the JavaScript console, and this is where you can print stuff out to the screen. So if I run this example, if I run the code that we have here, we should see John and example print out on the console. And there we go. So console.log is a way for us to print out stuff to the screen or to the console. So this is how you basically call a variable and access, the value that's stored in a variable. Now, obviously, this isn't too useful, but in the future videos that I will be doing, we will see how we can actually make some actual practical use of variables as we go over how to do conditions, arithmetic, operations, you're going to see that the usage of variables are actually much more practical than just these little examples that I've been showing you. But that's all I wanted to go over in this video. I will include a link to these examples in the description of the video, and hopefully this made sense. Please leave any recommendations or comments that you might have or questions in the comments of this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.